My name is Rosemary Hunter. I am a board member of CCPH, have been for about 7 years now, and I've had a lot of privilege and pleasure of working in many communities doing this work and learning from CCPH. I'm also the Dean of the School of Leadership Study at Gonzaga University, and have had also the pleasure of hosting Al there. Al Richmond, our Executive Director of CCPH, also has been with CCPH since about 2013. He's been engaged as a principal investigator in many research endeavors with Bakori and others, but what I want to talk about and highlight in his extensive biography is that in August of 2017, he launched what was then the inaugural session of Structural Inequality, an on-the-ground view. This has grown now into many different communities, but it's a highly experiential session, and it's provided a look through the lens of equity to develop and expand an understanding of structural and historical factors contributing to racism in America. As we go further in this conversation, we're going to hear a lot more about Al's experiences and what's led him to do this work and to be the leader of CCPH in this time. I'd also like to take a minute to introduce our other panelist here, Paige Castro-Reyes, who is a project coordinator with CCPH. Paige's background has been from the University of Washington. She graduated in 2013 and then joined CCPH at that time. We've been fortunate, the three of us, to have worked together over these past 7 years. Her background is in biology, international studies, and comparative religions. But her work really here over the past 7 years has really been to support the organization in a variety of both in-person and virtual community engagement efforts, including ethics of research, cultural responsive research practices, and working with the engagement that CCPH has with Robert Wood Foundation, Corey, and Greenwald Foundation. And I'll stop there, and at this point, I'd like to hand it over to Paige to talk a little bit about the ground rules as we get started here.
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this discussion. We wanted to come together, and before we start, as Rosie mentioned, here are some ground rules. Your audio and phones will remain muted for the duration of the call, but we invite you, if you have any questions for any of us, to submit your questions in the Q&A box. We will not be able to monitor chat for questions, so please submit any questions that you have through that Q&A function. This webinar is being recorded, and this and any prior CCPH partnered webinars are available on our website at ccphealth.org for you all to review and share with your networks. And lastly, we are aware that hackers have successfully accessed Zoom webinars to distribute disturbing images. At any point that we are aware that such attempts are being made to this webinar, we will immediately suspend the session. We believe that such action is necessary to minimize the further dissemination and possible exploitation that might be shared.
Thank you, Paige. We're going to go forward now with having a conversation both with Al and Paige to really get an understanding of where CCPH is at right now, both of their experiences that they have both personally in their own lived experiences, but also as they see the work of CCPH going forward. With that in mind, Al, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what led to your involvement with CCPH. Where did your passion come from, and why do you think this work is so important?
Thank you, Rosie. It's been a while since we've been together. We were last together in Spokane on the campus of Gonzaga University, and that was an amazing experience for me. And I'm glad that I was there for a week and had an opportunity to spend time in Spokane on the campus, meeting students and faculty. I could not have imagined that, 4 months later, the world would actually be so different, in terms of our inability to travel as freely as we once did, and also issues around racism in this country that have really just kind of surfaced and are so front and center in our whole dialogue. So a little about CCPH. We were founded in 1997. We were founded on the campus of the University of Washington. Our primary mission has always been around building partnerships between academic institutions and the community to address issues around health equity, but also social justice as well. But not only are we focused on building partnerships between community and academic institutions, but also other organizations, health departments, public and private organizations. We have really excelled, I think, in the area of understanding the power of partnerships, advancing that scholarship, and the practical application of that. So we have organized our work around 5 primary pillars that I may talk a little bit about later on in our discussion today, but they've primarily been focused on leading, convening, partnering, training, and disseminating. And what I would say is that at any given time, all of these are clearly on demonstration at any point in time, in fact, multiple ones. So when we're leading, we're out there. Typically, we are engaged in convening people from around the country, around the world together. We work in partnership with other organizations to do our work. We also are engaged in training. And then we certainly want to disseminate that work to others, both community and people in the academy and other organizations. So one of the things that, I really kind of have wanted to do this because for a number of reasons, and is that sometimes I think that people kind of like think about me in the context of CCPH, but there's a lot more there, right, about me and the work that I've done. That includes my work at a county Department of Social Services, at a public health agency, working for the state of North Carolina, as well as in nonprofits. I'm most proud probably of the work that I did at the North Carolina Institute for Minority and Economic Development, where I worked with an amazing team to address issues around community and economic development. It was there that I really began to understand about the intersectionality of health and community and economic development. And so that's a little about myself, but also I have a deep love for my community. And so when I worked in the County Department of Social Services and the Public Health Department, it gave me an opportunity to really better understand the principles of engagement, also around community-based participatory research. And I would say finally, what really led to my involvement in CCPH is my commitment to social justice and health equity. And I felt that CCPH would provide me with an opportunity, even a platform, to be able to advance that work.
Al and Paige, in the most recent CCPH newsletter, these words that we see here now on the screen was what appeared. This is what the newsletter was about. The words "help us," adiamos,
Yes.
and "azuda" hit. And I want to also call attention that I know that the final language, Azuda Hit, is also indigenous language that speaks to Paige's heritage as a mestiza Chamorro woman. And so I really want to put this question to both of you to get an understanding of what was your feeling behind this? What is this message about to the membership and the broader community of CCPH? Paige, could you begin?
Yeah, thank you, Rosie, for sharing just our statement. over the last several weeks, as things have unfolded with the social and racial justice uprisings across the US and the country, Al and I, we were receiving a lot of emails and statements from organizations that are new to this work, organizations that have been doing this work, and corporations as well. And, the thing that for us in all of the last several years, especially since the inaugural Structural Inequalities Intensive, which I will speak more about, this vocab around structural racism, around inequalities, this has been a part of our work for a long time, for many years, and for Al even longer. And so what we were seeing in these statements, is an acknowledgement of that, but we didn't have anything else to acknowledge beyond what the work that our work already speaks for us, and what we've been doing, and what we value, and what we're working towards. And it's a lot of the things that are being shared on the streets across the country, and by activists that have been doing this work for many, many years. And so we felt that a long, lengthy statement that many organizations are doing in solidarity, words are great, but we need action. And that's where this statement came from, that partnerships are needed to really piece together what activists, community organizations, and community voices have been saying for decades. And so that is where this statement was coming out of.
Yeah. So Paige is absolutely right. I mean, I actually attribute this to her. We call this our non-statement because we felt that so many people were just kind of like adding, lip service. Actually, they were talking it, but there really was no evidence that they were committed to issues around justice and equity. And so we decided to kind of reframe our statement to really actually make a statement about actually people doing something. And so this whole idea of Help Us is really about helping us on two different levels. So I will say that, first of all, I would say that as an African-American man or as a Black man, I would say that it's about helping us, helping Black men and women who have really been in the struggle and have been fighting for issues around justice and equity forever, ever since the enslaved people arrived on the shores of the US. And certainly in this moment, that it's important to bring attention to the struggle. And I think that this particular struggle is connected to earlier struggles, and that it's through partnerships, it's through people working together, specifically with African Americans in this country, to address issues around the militarization of the police, around issues of just injustice in general. So it's really about that personal work that you can do to help us. On another level, it's also about people we hope that will join with CCPH, with Community Campus Partnerships for Health, to really help us to do this work. We can't do this work alone. I mean, as you see on the statement, is that the work of dismantling racist systems can only be done through partnerships. And so we value, we treasure, we honor, we central to our work is the whole idea of dismantling racist systems. Some people might ask, is this new work? Is this different work? How does this work differ than in the past? I don't think it's any different than what we've been doing for a number of years. But I think that what it does do is actually it calls out racism explicitly. that we're not just saying that these are individual acts, these are microaggressions, this is implicit bias or anything, but it is racism in our system. And so Rosie and Paige knows this as well. Sometimes when I present about structure and equality, I talk about it's baked into the system. And so when you think about baking a cookie, or when you think about baking a cake or anything that you love and dear to you, when you think about the end product, it's hard to actually extrapolate and pull out and disaggregate that. And so for me, I believe that the United States has systemic racism. It was founded on that, continues to operate in large measure as a result of that. And that it's hard to kind of like, sometimes people don't see it because it's just who we are as an organization. In other words, it's baked into the system. So we need your help. Help us to work in partnerships with you and others to dismantle structural racism in this country.
Thank you, Paige and Al. I have to sort of react myself that when this came across in a newsletter, how powerful it was to me as an individual. I think I've, like many of us, have read many things, has been on the news, have been in conversations and dialogue. But the power of these words and the way that you presented it and the phrase underneath, I think just brought home and centered so many things that I was feeling in a way that perhaps I couldn't talk about it without having some kind of long conversation. And I feel like you just centered both emotion in these words, but also then the work that needs to be done and how it needs to be done and what we need help with. And the power of being able to say that in multiple languages and the importance of that and what that also speaks to was just very powerful and important. And so I want to thank your thinking and all that went into that, because it was a very important message and one that I feel like just hit on so many levels. In this same context, Al, with all that's occurring right now, and as you just talked about and your own positionality in this space, as an African American, as a Black man, would you be willing to share how you're feeling at this time, and also in a place of leadership?
Yeah, sure. So, Rosie, you and I have, what's occurring today is something that we've been working on, and that is building a trusting relationship. So when I thought about, this point of vulnerability of really talking to you, but also talking to all of those that have joined us today, it was really about the fact that we have a level and a degree of trust between ourselves that makes this possible to have this kind of conversation. And oftentimes we talk about trust, but it's rarely on display. And people don't feel it. And so I'm able to talk about this today because of the fact that we have a trusting relationship. So I want to step back and talk a little bit about, before I talk about how I feel in this moment, I want people to know a little bit about me. And I think that this moment in the US has given an opportunity for many people to really express how they feel and who they are. And that's something that doesn't always come out. So I'll share a little bit about myself and then talk about my feelings. First of all, I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was born at Good Samaritan Hospital, which at that time was the only Black hospital in the region, in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. I have a twin sister. My mother delivered both of us without any significant complications. When I think about that, I'm actually very glad that there were no complications, because I wonder what the abilities or capabilities of that hospital would have been if my mother had had some kind of complications. So I was born in an all-Black hospital. I grew up as a member of the AME Zion Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. That church was founded in the 1700s. I attended that church and part of that denomination for most of my life. I attended the college that was affiliated with the AME Zion Church, Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina. And that Livingstone is one of over 100 historically Black colleges and universities in the country. What's interesting about that, and you see this thread, is that I was born at a Black hospital. I was a member of an all-Black, safely to say, denomination of over 1 million people at that time when I was growing up, spread out throughout the world. And then I went to a historically Black college. So the thread is that I see there as I think about this is the fact that I have been part of segregated systems most of my life. And I've been part of systems that actually were created and institutions that were created as a way of a counter narrative, as a way of pushing against systems that kept people that look like me, Black people, out. And that included my church, my college, and the hospital that I was born at. And so it's really important for people to understand that about me, like who I am, but not just me as a person having grown up in a very segregated South, but to also understand that this influences who I am as an individual. I've seen so much, and I think that this moment has really brought a lot of that out. And I'm hearing people talk about, in particular, Black men are talking about their pain, the stress, just their life experiences of growing up in the United States and how difficult and how challenging those have been. So at this moment, I have a lot of mixed emotions. My emotions kind of range from sometimes I'm feeling very optimistic and very hopeful, and then there are times when I'm not feeling that way. I want to bring attention to one incident in the last month that has really certainly influenced my emotions. We've talked a lot about George Floyd and what happened to him in those minutes and seconds as his life was being kind of snatched away from him. We're not talking as much about Christian Cooper, a Black man who had an experience that now has kind of gone globally. And this was an exchange between Mr. Cooper and a white woman in New York in Central Park. I call out her race and I call out his race because I think that sometimes we don't do that. And that actually doesn't really help us at all, because their race is what was central, quite frankly, to the whole exchange between those two individuals. And so I can say to you that my emotion was really raw. Each time I look at, it was so raw when I saw that image, that video. I mean, I keep looking at it, and each time it has pretty much the same effect, because it really actually kind of encapsulates what it means to be an African American in this country. Her words were basically, during that interaction, is that I'm going to call the police and I'm going to tell them that an African American man is attacking me and my dog. And what that means to me is that somewhere along the way, she had internalized and understood what it meant to say to the police that it was an African American man engaged in some type of aggressive or hostile manner towards her as a white female. So what is it about that? I mean, what is it about that? That is, we think about George Floyd, but I think also thinking about that Central Park experience, kind of juxtaposition, wherein they may be on the end of a continuum, but they certainly are no less connected in terms of racism in this country. And so I share that because that really, of the last month, that continues to just kind of resonate. And I can assure you that there are many other people that feel the same way about that. I want to just also share with you, I was listening this morning to Nina Simone, and I was listening to her song, I Wish You Knew How I Feel to Be Free. And in that, the part of that, what that really kind of sticks out to me is when she says, I wish you knew what it means to be me, then you'd see and agree that every man should be free. And that is the cry, that is the call, that has always been the call from the earth of Black people in this country, from enslavement, through Jim Crow, through segregation, and even in this moment, people just want to be free.
Thank you, Al. Thank you very much for your willingness to share it, your feelings. I know that it's a vulnerable time for you to be able to talk about this, and that I also know how much vulnerability is your strength, and I'm grateful. You talked a little bit about our own relationship, and that we've been developing this relationship over time and trust over time. And I think something that I want to be able to sort of also share in that moment is one, the gift that is, and the hard work that is for us as individuals, right? Like we don't just say the words trust and they appear, right? Like it takes investment, it takes understanding, it takes being willing to be vulnerable, to really look at ourselves from inside out and how we, our own positionalities, so much more than I could say, but I wanted to sort of insert that here because I think sometimes we think, oh, there's a trusting relationship that just happened. And it's like, no, actually that doesn't just happen. It takes a lot. And there has to be, the authentic, honest commitment to do the work long-term together that takes. So thank you for that. As you shared your experience and how you really have had experiences that exposed you to being in systems and being raised and grown through systems that included much segregation. I also want to think about, as you and I have talked about, what's a turning point, or have been turning points in your life, or a story that you'd like to share, because I know I've been fortunate to hear some of those, and I think they're important to also talk about.
Oh, Rosie, I have so many stories. I feel like the older I get, the more stories I have. So I'll just share one story, and I'll kind of pivot a little bit in that story to kind of speak to what you're talking about, and that is that I talk about growing up in a segregated South. And I talk about, some of my experiences in my own community, in my own church, and even attending a historically Black college. But I also want to reflect on in the fourth grade, what happened to me. And that was in the fourth grade. It was actually at the end of the third grade. It was announced that our school would be closing. The school that I was attending, Biddleville Elementary School in Charlotte, would be closing. And that the next year we would actually be going to a new school. And we were all excited. And I didn't have an appreciation to really what was happening at that time. Biddleville was an all Black school. There were no white teachers, I can recall, and certainly no white students at that school. And the next year, we went to a bright, shiny new school in Charlotte. And my sister and I were so excited about this bright, shiny new school that had been built. And we thought that the school had been built just for us. We were so excited because our old school was really in bad shape. And in fact, as soon as the new building was open, the old building was condemned and was actually torn down to make way for an interstate in Charlotte. But in looking back at that experience, I realize now that it really wasn't built for me and my sister. It was actually built for white children. This bright, shiny new school that was in a predominantly Black, if not all Black neighborhood, was built because the system had decided to integrate, and that the school was not good enough for white kids, but it certainly was okay. The old school was good enough for the Black kids. And so when I look back and think about that, I was like, wow, that really begs a question. If Biddleville Elementary School, the all Black school, was not good enough for Black kids, I mean, it was good enough for Black kids, but it wasn't good enough for white kids, then why was this new school not good enough for me? And so it just made me think deeply about that, my experiences growing up in a segregated school and then an integrated school. And what's so interesting about that is I went back and looked at and that's been over 40 years, looked at that school. But today, that school is almost as segregated today as it was almost 40 years ago, over 40 years ago. In fact, 85% of the students that are enrolled in that school get free and reduced lunch, and over 85% of them are Black or Hispanic. And so in all these years and all that work that was done, we've not really grown very far from where we were over 40, 50 years ago. And that's really very sad.
Thank you, Al. I also like to talk a little bit as we look and reflect about what is going on in this moment. What is it that you also hope will come from this moment? And Paige, I'd like to engage you also in this conversation, both of you, when you think about what's happening, your own work together and the work that you've been doing over these years. What do you hope will come from this moment?
Yeah, so I think that over the last 7 years that I've been with CCPH, I myself have been doing a lot of personal work. My work as an Indigenous Chamorro woman, my work as a non-Black person. And I think that what I'm hoping to see in the partnerships that CCPH builds, in the partnerships and coalitions that are building as we speak, around dismantling structural racism, I hope that the leaders that have traditionally been leading, that they listen and they reflect and do their own personal work. Because the main thing for me is that in my work as with CCPH and the work that we do with structural inequality, you know, for me to speak up around things that, you know, that we see that are wrong, or even within partnerships on power dynamics around budget, having these conversations and seeing where, you know, the institutional power, which traditionally is rooted in white supremacy, that we can talk and have honest conversations about that and think about where you've been privileged in that. And so for me to come to CCPH and do this work, I need to question myself. So in the partnerships that CCPH has and that are building around across the country and the globe, I hope that non-Black partners continue to question themselves and continue to acknowledge these privileges and work towards, you know, dismantling these inequitable systems so that our communities as a whole can achieve that health and well-being that we're altruistically trying to achieve, but it also comes with this self-reflection that is ongoing.
And so Paige and I are on a journey too. I mean, we work together. We've been working together for almost 6, 7 years. So my hope is that people will be able to interact and interface with their colleagues, their partners who look maybe different from them, who've had different experiences. You know, I describe my experiences. Paige has her set of experiences, and Rosie, you have yours. And so my hope is that in this moment that people will, in particular for white people, that they will suspend this idea that all people's experiences have been the same, right? So in particular, when we think about policing, we don't think about the fact that everyone hasn't had the same kind of experiences that others have had with the police or with systems of power and privilege. They just haven't. And so the work that we do has to be always, you know, central to that work has to be the idea of anti-racism, but also has to be the idea of understanding people's lived experiences and how they're similar or maybe dissimilar. So my hope is even that, as Paige has mentioned, that there is a shifting of resources. My biggest concern in this moment, Rosie, I have a hope. You asked me about the hope, but I want to caution, I have a cautionary note, and that is that in our desire to actually build new systems, because I believe that systems can be dismantled, but as we work together in partnership to build new systems, that we're cautious that we don't take some of the same old stuff from the old construction and bring it with us. And specifically what that means is that we center that white people cannot just center themselves in this moment, right? In this new system. And not just white people, but also academic institutions. It has to be authentic partnerships where you're willing, as Paige said, to kind of like act out of humility and not just recreate the same stuff over and over and over again. And that's something that I'm really concerned about. That's a cautionary no. So again, I'm hopeful that we can do this work, and we do this work in partnerships, but we do it in a different way that has a lens of anti-racism, organizing, and true authentic partnerships that honor and values all people in their different perspectives and lived experiences.
Thank you, both Paige and Al. I appreciate that. Al, with that in mind, let's talk a little bit then about how CCPH is organizing in this time.
Right. So we're organizing on 3 different levels. First of all, back in 2016, when Dr. Kamara Jones became the president of the American Public Health Association, it was CCPH that stepped up with her and joined in a national effort, a movement to actually name racism as a public health crisis, as a public health issue. That was the first thing that we did back in 2016. The second thing that we did, as Paige mentioned earlier, was that we developed this training. This training is called Dismantling Structural Inequalities. This particular session was done last year in New Orleans with the Ashe Cultural Arts Center, and it was Dismantling Structural Inequality, Infusing Art in Our Work, where we looked at how humanities and arts can be used to tell the story about structural inequality and racism in this nation, but also can be used to dismantle racism and also dismantle structural inequality. And so that might be the spoken word, it might be drama, it may be music. That was a powerful experience for us to be together to talk about how we can use the arts to really bring out these issues around structural inequality and racism. And in some ways, I think that's what we're seeing today, because it was those images of George Floyd that actually, I think, really pricked the conscience of people globally. It was the visual. And so when you think about the arts, the truth is that once you see it or even feel it, you can't unsee it. And so those images will forever be there. In fact, many people are saying that this particular moment is very similar to the moment of Emmett Till, when his mother made the decision to actually open up his casket so that people could actually see what it looked like to have been beaten and maimed in this way because of a visit into the South and an attack by individuals, by racist individuals. And then subsequent to that was not just her opening up the casket, but also those images were broadcast across the world and in Jet and Ebony magazine, which were magazines that most Black people at one time subscribed to. So the arts is a very powerful thing. So that's the second thing that we did. And the third thing that we're doing, and that's today, is we're continuing on, is building a movement. We want to build a movement where community campus partnerships are working through authentic partnerships to address issues of dismantling structural inequality and racism in this country. So those are the 3 things that we're doing. Those are the things that we want people to connect in with us and help us. There is no movement without organizing. There's just no movement without organizing. And so I think that what we see in this moment is how organizing over the past 3 to 5 years has actually catapulted this issue around the militarization of policing in this country to the forefront, not just here in the United States, but globally.
Thank you. I'm going to stop us here a little bit and actually turn to questions from the audience and encourage the audience to please feel free to put more questions in the question and answer box. But if we could just turn to this a minute, I've got one, Al, that says, can you speak to how systemic racism shows up and how community-based organizations for not-for-profit such as CCPH receive and get funding? Specifically, how things like implicit bias and the segregation that you spoke of prevents Black leaders of CBOs and not-for-profits from being at the table.
Yeah. So data has clearly shown that organizations that are led by African Americans or other people of color receive less in terms of philanthropic dollars. And that has to end. That is what I'm talking about in terms of we cannot create a system to address these issues if that system is grounded and rooted in issues around white supremacy and around segregation and structural inequality. We have to give people access to the capital and the resources that are needed. And those have to be invested in the community. People from the community have to lead that work. You know, we need to get away from these paternalistic ideas that we know best, even in the academy, what people need in the community. We have to work with them and allow them to lead that work. And we then need to give them resources. You know, what I say to people is that our problem is not, and I would say that this is probably consistent for every organization I know that's led by people of color. It's not that we lack ability, capability, intellect, skill, knowledge, expertise, vision, or mission. What we lack are resources. When you put the resources in the hands of the right people, then they can make that change. And that change needs to start from the inside out. So what we've traditionally done is kind of like a hierarchy of giving and a hierarchy of allocation of resources. And it's a top-down model. And so people think that once they just give an organization $30,000, that solves a problem. It doesn't. You have to give them the adequate resources that would allow them to do the work that's so important in that community.
Thank you. Paige, have you identified additional questions and answers that you'd like to ask Al at this time from our question and answers from the audience?
Yeah, one other question that we received was, can you describe what you think a true partnership looks like?
Okay, yeah. So there's our CCPH definition, and I'll just tell you what I actually think, and that is that a true authentic partnership is what you're seeing on display today. The ability to talk openly and candidly among the partners that are in that group. It doesn't just happen. It takes time, maybe even years. I have a partnership that I think is a true authentic partnership with Giselle Corby-Smith at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. That's a partnership that has taken 20 years to develop and cultivate. It's a partnership that actually talks about, and the center to that work is this idea of creating win-wins for everyone. And also, while I'm not in the academy and Giselle is, she still recognizes that as a community person, I bring that unique perspective. That's what a true authentic partnership is that it's a level playing field where everyone is allowed to grow and to develop and to contribute, and then resourced to the degree that they need to be. Show me the money and I'll show you your commitment to authentic partnerships. I said this. If you look on our website, you'll see a clip that Giselle and I did at the 2019 PCORI annual meeting. And I said just that. And people have been kind of like repeating that across the country, but it's true. Show me your budget and I'll show you your commitment to authentic partnerships. If there's not equity in the budget, then there's really no true authentic partnership. I'm not saying that it's always going to be equal, but it needs to be some equity in that budget.
I have to agree with you, and I think that was hitting on the question that we got right before this one.
Right.
With, you know, we often see that partnerships will have titles or will have space that's created, but not going down to that resource level to make sure that resources are being distributed across all the partners. And we have all kinds of, again, structural barriers of why that doesn't happen that are baked in, if I can use your words, to our systems.
Mm-hmm.
That talks about why community members aren't getting those funds. And I feel like that's the work that CCPH has been so active in. One of the things that you know about me is that the partnership work that I've done, I've really learned how to do from CCPH. Back when I did my dissertation, CCPH was the only organization at that time that was really talking about this work and talking about what reciprocity means, who defines what reciprocity is, and what is mutually beneficial, and who's making those determinations. And at that time, and still came up with you know, principles for how we can build partnerships. So I have to say that they've guided my work, and I greatly appreciate that I've got an organization that I can go to say, here's actually the work that's been done. Here's the literature. Here's the people in the community. Here's what's been published in these areas, to be able to give it the credibility that begins to shift systems in different ways. So with all of this and the work that CCPH has been doing, you and Paige have been very active in, I'm going to ask both of you, what is it that keeps you up at night regarding this kind of work?
Paige, I'm throwing it to you first.
We'll start with you.
I think what keeps me up at night, what keeps my gears moving, is thinking really, you know, this structural approach that I've learned and cultivated at my time at CCPH, looking at these root causes or the baseline ingredients for different systems that we're operating in. And whether that is in a community academic partnership, you know, sometimes CCPH is the community organization, sometimes we're a liaison for academic and community partner organizations. And, you know, I think that this lens that we have to our work, you know, we can see within our partnerships or within, you know, just the conversations that Al and I have around, you know, a big thing is budget. Like, that's when you can look and you can numerically see, you know, where the root causes or the indicators of inequality within a partnership, that is a numerical value. And so looking at that and just trying to envision, what does it look like for, you know, that equity to be center to a partnership, to this work, and to the systems that I live and exist in, as well as a non-Black person, as an Indigenous person. You know, looking at what values are being centered in the systems as we know it right now, and how does that need to be dismantled? And then also the practical indicators such as budget that, you know, there's this big question of not knowing, where do I start? How do I have these conversations, feeling uncomfortable or trying to be well-intentioned? You know, these are things that I've seen or have felt myself. And I think that, you know, just listening to, these are the values that are being laid bare for us as a country and as a world, that you know, the valuing of police budgets, the valuing of, you know, just trying to think about how to center these systems back onto these values of reciprocity, as you mentioned, Rosie, as of equity, equality, and you know, the health of the community. And I think the big thing for people working in institutions and positions of power is understanding that it's not coming from your institution, that, you know, the listening, you have the resources and you need to listen. And so it's a long answer to what keeps me up at night, but I really do think to that minute level of detail. So
Yeah.
Thank you, Paige.
So
Al?
what keeps me up at night? I feel like sometimes I haven't done enough. And so it's, you know, when I reflect upon it, or I wake up in the middle, when I'm trying to settle down at nighttime, or I wake up in the middle of the night, I feel like I didn't do enough that day, that there's more to do. And sometimes I just get up and write notes and try to figure it all out, notes to myself. I email myself and all of that. But it's just a feeling that of inadequacy sometimes, not in my own skills and ability, but maybe the fact that I don't have the resources to do what I want to do. It seems like, Rosie, central to this conversation has been around resources, right? You know, part of it is resources, is we need the resources to be able to do what we want to do, the good that we believe we can do, and putting that money into the hands of people who can do that. So that's what kind of keeps me up at nighttime.
Okay, so I'm going to switch it up on you. What gets you up in the morning then?
So every morning I get up, I'll go first, Paige. I want to acknowledge, I love what Paige said about the ingredients. Oh, that was just powerful in terms of what's baked into the system. And when you said that, Paige, I thought about what's baked into the system is a hierarchy, you know, a racial hierarchy at times, and that's baked into the system. White supremacy is baked into the system, that the oppression is baked into the system. The whole idea of scarcity is baked into the system. We believe that we don't have enough. And Rosie, this wasn't your question, but I've been saying to people, look, in 3 months, we found $2 trillion, and we're still finding money. We're going to have to pay for it on the back end, right? In response to COVID-19. But where was all that money when we were trying to increase our budgets around education? Where was that money when we were trying to fund historically Black colleges and universities? Where was that money when we were trying to fund our healthcare system? And so I'm getting up now because I'm hopeful about the fact that this moment will be a moment of change. And one of the words that people are using is kind of like, we are reimagining our world as being something different than what it's been in the past.
Thank you. Paige, I'm just going to check in with you to see, I know we're getting towards the end, and I want to make sure that we've been able to attend to questions from the audience.
yeah.
Do we have any additional ones that have come up before we get too close to our end here?
Yeah, so we have 3 more questions. And so we've discussed some of this, but can we talk about what community engagement looks like at institutional and structural levels when addressing institutional and structural racism?
So for me, it starts with an acknowledgement of the history of each institution. There are a number of schools, academic institutions across the United States are exploring the connection between that institution, the founding of that institution, and the founders themselves. Some were slave owners, others were white supremacists. And so it starts with a deep recognition of the history of the institution. How was it founded? Who was it founded for? I was on the campus of Yale University, and they were sharing with me that some of the buildings still reflect the fact that the school was built for men only, right? And so the first women at Yale didn't even have a dormitory. They actually stayed, I believe, in the um, upper levels and the attics of some of the buildings. So because it wasn't even built for them, and that wasn't that long ago, right? Not just the founding, but the more recently in terms of women being on the campus at Yale University. So we have to look at that. We have to acknowledge that. What is the history of the institution? What is the relationship between that institution and the community? Is it good? Is it bad? What is it like? Exploring all of those kinds of issues are critically important. And then I think once we put all that out there and we do that deep dive and do that work, and it's going to be painful and it's going to be very difficult work, that we then can move to the next phase. But hey, Dean Hunter, we have a question for you, Rosie. And someone says, can you speak to the intentional role of allies and resource equity and authenticity of partnerships and trust that you described?
Sure, thank you, and thank you for the question. I want to start first, before I answer that, with going back to something that Paige said, and that is self-work. So allies need to first make sure that they're doing the self-work that's needed and ongoing all the time, doesn't stop. I'm sorry, it's 24/7. That has to be part of it. And then thinking about my own positionality. So I'll talk from a more personal space, but I have a certain power and privilege as I walk into spaces as a dean, as a woman with my whiteness. How do I share those spaces of power and privilege intentionally, strategically? How do I redistribute those spaces of power and privilege as an ally? How do I use my voice? How do I use my positionality? And it's not just in what we say or statements that we made. It is about what I call courageous conversations in systems, about structures, and with other allies. But it's also about who and how we bring different communities to the table. If I'm going to a meeting, if I'm going to where there is access or greater access, who comes with me? Who goes for me? How do we go together? There's no reason I should ever show up alone anywhere when there are so many individuals that I work with, community partners across different race, ethnicity, experiences of class and gender that need to be in those spaces with me. The thing I constantly ask myself when I'm in a position is, are those who are most affected by these issues at the table? And are they at the table in a space where they can have impact on the decisions that are being made? So I feel like the authentic part of my partnership is to make sure that I use whatever means I have to create those kinds of spaces.
Thank you. Yeah.
So in our final minute, what are some sort of closing thoughts, Al and Paige, that you'd like to end this conversation with and give to our audience as we close?
Help us. Help us do this work. Reach out to CCPH, join us as part of this movement. Help us in terms of, through your membership. We need to hear from you. Share this webinar series. It will be placed on our website. Invite us to your campus. Invite us into your work, into your partnerships. We hope that this will not be the last conversation and that we'll have future conversations similar to this. I'm glad we did this, and I'm very appreciative. I just want to acknowledge my twin sisters on the call. She's listening in, and Andrea, and I'm really glad that she's part of this, and she was amening me when I was talking about our birth, as well as the shared experiences that we've had around racism. Be hopeful, remain hopeful. John Lewis is an amazing American. Congressman Lewis is alive today, and he's fighting stage 4 cancer, but he's still in the battle. This is not over with, and we want you to join with us as we continue to fight for justice and equity in this country and globally.
Thank you.
Thank
Paige,
you.
any last words?
I think Al said it all. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you both. I greatly appreciate being part of it. And thank you to our audience for your attendance and your questions. Goodbye now.
Bye-bye.